Hello and welcome to the fourth section of our course, where we'll be focusing mainly on adding routing capabilities to our single-page application. We'll start by integrating ReactRouter, which will allow us to map URLs to different screens. Then we'll come back to our server-side rendering setup to make the changes necessary for routing to work isomorphically. Our setup will make it easy to implement a logout flow, which we'll do in our last video to complete the authentication experience. Today we'll see the simple fundamentals of using ReactRouter for the web. In our previous video, we set up some client-side persistence so that our application could have knowledge of the current user and force the login page to display if the user never authenticated or if the session has expired. Today we'll replace that logic with a bona fide routing scheme. We certainly could write an app where we figured out which screens to display based on the application state. This would be very cumbersome to maintain though, and it would prevent users from doing things like bookmarking specific pages. Most client-side frameworks have at least one routing solution, and for the technology we've chosen, ReactRouter is by far the most widely adopted and actively maintained solution for React web apps and React Native alike. Our plan of action today is pretty straightforward. We'll start by replacing our manual conditional display logic with routes and redirects provided by ReactRouter. After that, we'll be adding additional routes to our app, which we'll then link to in a navigation menu that we'll be building. To start things off, we need to download two dependencies, ReactRouter and ReactRouter DOM. We'll need to integrate the router into the application, but first I'm going to create a new component that's going to declare my top-level routes. So if you recall from last time, we currently have two screens. We have the login screen and the home screen, which displays the RGB component. Our first step is to replicate that setup, so we'll import both of those screens. There are a couple of ReactRouter DOM components that we need in order to map these screens to different URLs. So my component will be a simple function that displays one of these two screens. I'll achieve this by using the switch component. This component will ensure that only one of its child routes will be matched. So if we go to /login, we'll see the login component, and if we get any other URL, it'll show the home screen. Now we're ready to bring this in as what will serve as the root of our application. We just need to make a couple small changes. Instead of my home component, I need to import the app component we just defined, and I also need the browser router from ReactRouter DOM. Now my browser router can go right underneath the provider, and we'll render our app component within the router. Now we need to make a couple small changes to the components that render our two screens. Let's start with the home component. We really don't have much to change here. To start with, we'll need a couple components from ReactRouter DOM, and we're no longer explicitly rendering the login page, so we can remove that import. Now if I'm not authenticated, instead of rendering the login component, I'll render a redirect with a path name of /login. Rendering this will cause ReactRouter to redirect me to that path. And now instead of explicitly rendering the RGB component, I'll render a route that displays it if the path is just a /. Note the use of the exact prop. This makes sure that this route will use exact matching on the path, so that it won't render if there's any path fragments after the /. Now let's make some quick changes to our login component. What we'll need to do here is fairly similar to what we did with the home component. First, we'll need the redirect component. Next, I'm going to keep another state variable to indicate that my login was successful. This flag will be used to signal a redirect. We can set that flag by adding a success handler to our login function. Finally, in our render function, we'll check our success flag and redirect to the root path if it evaluates to true, which will take us back to our home screen. That should be all we need, so let's try this out. Now we'll build a navigation menu that can take us to each of these pages. The active nav link will display in a different style than the rest, so I'll define a quick function to conditionally apply class names. This will take a dictionary that maps a class name to a condition, and also a list of classes to be unconditionally applied. Then we'll do an operation on the dictionary of conditional classes. We'll use the reduce function to return only the classes whose condition evaluates to a truthy value. This will get a starting value of the unconditionally applied classes that were passed in as the second argument. This returns an array of class names which will join with an empty space. Now let's define the component to render the navigation link. This will use both the link and route components from ReactRouter DOM as well as the class names function that we just defined. The navLink component will accept a toProp that indicates the path, and a child node to display inside of the link. Now instead of just rendering a link, we wrap our display in a route component, which is able to tell us whether or not the current route matches the path that got passed in. If the route is a match, the class names function will add the peer menu selected class onto the peer menu item class. The links will display in an unordered list, so we'll render a list item with our computed classes, and inside that we'll display a link to the specified path. The children are then rendered inside the link component. Now we'll define the menu that will render these nav links. All we need here is the nav link that we just defined. Then we just render a pure CSS menu with an unordered list that renders nav links to each of our authenticated screens. Now we just need to update our home component to display the navigation menu and add routes to our new pages. All I need to do is import the nav menu and our new pages, and then render the nav and add a route declaration for my new screens. That's the last of what we'll need, so let's see what the nav menu looks like. Every link takes me to where I expected to go, so it looks like we've accomplished our final task. That's all the time we have for this lesson. Today we introduced client-side routing with ReactRouter and added a navigation menu to our application.